Turn it up at this time.
One second.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, from wherever you may be joining us. We'll just wait a minute or two as everyone logs on to the Zoom channels and joins us over Facebook, where we'll be streaming live. Looking forward to today's presentations. We will be gradually bringing everybody to the front. If you'd like to turn on your cameras as you receive the capability to do so, please feel free. We'll be taking questions over the course of the event and in the chat box, and please feel free to raise your hand later on in the webinar, and we will try to take some of the questions live on screen. All right, looks like we have everybody signing on at this point. Once again, thank you for joining us today. You can direct your questions to the chat box during the event, and we look forward to having a lively Q&A session in the latter half of today's program. But at this time, we'll hand it off to our moderator today, Vuyo.
Thank you, Ira. I hope everyone is well. I'm quite excited to be the moderator for this very, very, very important topic. I think all of us around the world are actually seeing this type of trend that we're finding growing out of every corner of the world, even here in South Africa, in America, in Europe, even in Asia. And I think it's always important that those who have the means always tackle these topics before they get out of control. The University of the Free State, with ISGAP, brings to you a webinar on the following topic. The topic is the politics of othering and discrimination. I'm the moderator. My name is Vuyolwethu. I studied at the University of the Witwatersrand, and I'm also a research fellow with ISGAP. I hope that today, a lot of us will be able to ask the questions that we need to, and also learn some of the valuable lessons that we seem to be seeing all over the world. A lot of people are not willing to learn and be able to disseminate this information to those who actually need to hear it, and even add on to the information that we do have. As per the itinerary, the first lecture is titled An Unbearable Likeness of Being, Ontological Insecurity and the Creation of Enemy Others. Our lecturer for this very important topic will be Dr. Bianca Naude, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the University of the Free State.
Thank you, Chair, for that introduction, and I echo your sentiments. I'm very excited about this topic and this workshop that we are doing, and of course, very, very timely and important for us to talk about this, and I think actually long overdue. So it's my big pleasure to present this paper for this workshop, and the idea with this paper is to kind of provide a theoretical framework or a kind of an interpretive framework for the lectures that will follow by our colleagues. So I've kept it quite conceptual because then the empirical things I think will follow in the rest of the discussions that we will have. Right, so a little bit of a throwback there, or a little bit of a salute to Milan Kundera, of course, of his book, The Unbearable Likeness of Being, and I just kind of copied that title from him and made it The Unbearable Likeness of Being. Because my paper speaks to the need that people have to be different. And, you know, we tend to think of identity in terms of likeness or sameness, you know, what it is like to be something or someone, what it is like to be ourselves, you know, what we are like or who we are like. And this likeness for human beings satisfies a very primitive urge or a need to belong because group members see the group. So individual members who are part of a group see their group as seeking to achieve the same goals and vital needs that they have. And so this group they see as a collection of people who try to satisfy the same needs that they have in everyday life. And this causes them to idealize and identify with and love members of the collective. But likeness also necessarily draws borders and boundaries that exclude certain things, characteristics, experiences, people. By defining ourselves according to what we are like, we are also saying, I'm not like that person, I am not like this, I don't do those things. So we very much define ourselves not just in terms of sameness and likeness, but also against those things that we are not. And so otherness is a very essential ingredient of individual identities because it makes it possible for us to exist in the first place. If we were not able to identify or to explain, or what would be the word, define ourselves according to what we are not, it would be very difficult to define who we are in the first place. Now, otherness does not necessarily require a significant social distance, and I'd say social distance, and it's kind of in everybody's heads, we have to social distance, but the social distance that I'm talking about here is a kind of a different type of social distance in terms of our closeness to other people, maybe on a psychological or an emotional level. And we tend to think of others as people who are very much unlike us and people who are very different to how we are, and so people who are not as socially close to us. But otherness does not necessarily have to be or does not require this significant social distance. Even individual members of the same group that we belong to individuate themselves from one another through all kinds of minor differences which they seek to maintain, which prevents their identities from dissolving into one another. And so this is what my paper talks about today. So while negative identification or differentiation is an important and necessary and normal part of individual existence, these differences can become exaggerated during times of crisis when identities become threatened. And that we see, this is then when we see things like what has happened kind of recently, the catastrophic events in former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy before that. But also I think what we see happening at the moment in South Africa and elsewhere in the world in terms of xenophobic attacks and discrimination. Right, so I've said that this is a kind of an explanatory framework for my colleagues' presentations that follow. And so ultimately, my paper asks or sets out to explain how it is possible for foreigners or for neighbors or even family, people who consider themselves to be close to other people, to turn on each other and then to perpetuate or perpetrate these unspeakably violent acts on one another. So to do this, I talk about identification briefly, identification, belonging, and membership of a community, just to explain how it is that we construct our identities and why it is important for us to maintain the borders that kind of differentiate us or separate us from others. And then I talk about the narcissism of minor differences, which is a concept that Sigmund Freud had introduced to psychoanalysis, and I think is very relevant for our discussion today. So through social learning, children form ideas about significant others, other people who are important in their environment. It starts with the mother, then the father, eventually other caregivers, and eventually that extends to all members of the group that they belong to, who become important people according to whom they understand themselves and on whom they base their kind of identities. And they also form ideas about other cultural objects like language, food, traditions, signs and symbols, representations of history, mythologized heroes and heroines, and chosen glories and chosen traumas. And they form ideas about these things as being either good or bad. And so eventually they base their own self-concepts on these understandings of the social world, their own place in it, and the expectations that significant others have of them. So this is very important because, you know, we tend to model who we think we are, and we try to think of ourselves as good people. And we base these understandings of ourselves as good people on what we see around us and on what we've learned from significant others in our environment is a good way to behave or is a good way to be. And so this is important in defining ourselves. In parallel with these processes of internalization, children also invest emotional energy in significant others, which forms attachments or bonds that last throughout life. And that are very, very important, not just for achieving social goals, but also for individuals to maintain a coherent self-concept. These internalized ideas about the self and significant others, as well as the bonds that are formed between members of a social group, are partially constitutive of individual identities, providing persons with a sense of certainty about themselves, their place in the community, and the expectations, as I said, that group members have of them, which lays foundations for individuals to act with confidence across a range of situations, what we call ontological security. So ontological security, kind of a bit of a buzzword at the moment in IR scholarship especially, comes from psychoanalytic theory, which was then kind of appropriate by Anthony Giddens and his sociology. The idea that persons want to have, they have a deep need to have a consistent self-concept, a self-understanding, which is accompanied by an understanding of what is expected of that person and how they must act in order to live up to these social expectations. And so these social bonds and these ideas that people have about themselves help lay the foundations for agency, really. And so through their investment of emotional energy in their community, individual persons become attached to their in-groups. And so it becomes their priority to maintain and protect what they perceive to be the defining characteristics of the large group to which they belong, and specifically to protect the image of that group as being good. And I talk about it a little bit more later on. The reasons for an individual's need to preserve and protect the integrity of the large group's identity are many, but importantly, membership of a group enhances survival, while the emotional attachments that people have to their nationality, ethnicity, race, and other identity markers provides kind of the psychological borders that people need to maintain a coherent self-concept. So like I said in the beginning of my paper, the need that people have to be different in order to be able to define themselves, so that they don't kind of dissolve who they are. Their self-concept doesn't dissolve into this kind of mass identity as just a part of a faceless group of people. Now, the goodness of our in-group, you know, the idea, the image that we have of our in-group as being good, and of the allies of the group. So all the people that we identify as being like the group or with the group or an ally of the group, and therefore working with the group towards achieving certain social goals. This reinforces our own feelings of being good and strengthens our self-esteem, solidifying our internalized self-representations of living up to social norms and standards. So it allows us to have a coherent concept about ourselves and to feel good about the fact that we are actually living up to expectations of society. So group identity basically defines the individual. Without membership of a group, without these identity markers that belong to the group, we wouldn't be able to define ourselves, we wouldn't exist. Now, in creating allies, and I just mentioned the allies, people attribute those qualities that are collectively considered to be good qualities, like honesty, integrity, cleanliness, and loyalty, to members of the out-group as well, as members of the in-group, while also necessarily attributing bad qualities, things that they consider to be less socially acceptable, to members of the out-group. And in doing so, groups are able to create a psychological distance between the good us and the bad them, which allows them to maintain a feeling of certainty about their own group's goodness. Keeping an enemy at a psychological distance, and an enemy here doesn't necessarily have to refer to an antagonistic enemy other. It is just an other that is not considered to be a positive other, but an other that is considered to have a very big social distance. It's considered to be very unlike oneself or one's group. Keeping this enemy other at a psychological distance provides comfort and enhances social cohesion, since enemies provide the dark background that brings a group's light and strong qualities into relief. Now, my question arises here, if allies are so important for making us feel good about ourselves, and if we identify so positively with our allies, how is it possible for people to turn against neighbors who are normally considered to be allies, and to perpetrate these violent acts that we have recently seen, as for example in South Africa with xenophobia? And I think with xenophobia specifically in South Africa, we often ask, how is it possible if South Africans narrate themselves as being part of the African community, as being African in bone and in blood, how is it possible to turn around and harm our own African brothers and sisters? So this brings me to the concept of the narcissism of minor differences, and I think halfway through my paper, yeah, I think more or less. Enmity, like I mentioned, among large groups does not require significant social distance. Carl Filio is a British professor of psychosocial studies, and he has remarked that it is precisely communities with adjoining territories, as we see in history, that are related to each other in other ways as well, that are engaged in constant feuds and ridiculing each other. So we often find that it is people who actually are the closest socially to one another who end up in the most bitter and kind of violent conflicts. And I think, you know, Zambia, Rwanda, very good examples of how people are very close socially end up in a very violent struggle, as opposed to what we would normally expect, you know, kind of North versus South or West versus African or whatever. Now, he explains, Carl Filio, that the notion that we might be more alike than different drives people to create differences and to engage in acts of virulent aggression to maintain an essential feeling of non-sameness, since difference maintains a fragile equilibrium between identities that are a constant risk of dissolving into one another. So the risk of having one's identity dissolve into another is so deeply unsettling for individuals because it beckons a loss of self, an extinction of the ego. Basically, the feeling that one might cease to exist because one might not be able to continue to define themselves as different from another. So groups, like individuals, may create differences where the existence of the group identity becomes threatened, sometimes even turning this differentiation inward towards members of the in-group itself. And here, in-group, if I refer to the in-group, not necessarily the members of the exact same social group, but members who are considered to be close allies or neighbors. This exaggeration of small differences between and within groups that under normal circumstances would not have been observed or would have been overlooked was originally referred to by Sigmund Freud as the narcissism of minor differences. And these minor differences may become exaggerated, they may be blown up by people when their identities become challenged, when it starts to feel like they are not able to really pinpoint exactly who they are and define themselves anymore. So during times of stress, when group identities are shaken, either by a real or a perceived threat, and I think importantly a perceived threat, because we tend to think of threats as being something that we can measure quantitatively as existing. But sometimes that threat is perceived, it's imagined or subjective. But the consequences are as real as with a real threat. So when this happens, members of a large group exaggerate the minor differences between themselves and even their positive others, their allies, by focusing obsessively on the differences that they do have, however small they are, to cling to the illusion that the enemy is quite unlike us. So essentially, people and groups may fabricate difference to preserve a feeling of being different, or preserve the feeling that an other is an outsider, not like us. And in turning friendly others into enemy others, we externalize those images, as with other groups that we consider to be antagonistic enemy others, you know, people with whom we have a bigger social distance. Exactly the same process. We externalize these images that we think of in terms of an evil other or a bad them, unclean, you know, disloyal, all of these kind of markers that we might assign to them, to people that we normally would have seen as being part of the good us. And so it is during this process that friends and neighbors become enemies, and where violence against enemies is sanctioned as being acceptable because it protects the integrity of the group. All right, so the more that we see others as human, the more difficult it is to perpetrate acts of violence on them. This is because stable and secure group identities allow individual members to empathize with others, to put themselves in another person's shoes, so to speak, and to imagine what it would have been like to suffer the same fate, which normally keeps people from acting out violently, because they can imagine what they would have felt like if it had happened to them. Conversely, the less we see others as being human like us, the easier it becomes to inflict horrors on them. And so these processes of empathy become suspended when identities are threatened by the dissolution of borders between self and other, and when our identities begin to fade into a larger mass identity. And here I've made a note such as the African mass identity, which I think in South Africa, in my opinion, is a little bit of what's threatening the South African identity is a lot of trouble at home, a lot of political and social instability and difficulty. And so having that kind of identity issue inside of the country domestically, but then, you know, internationally not being able to really differentiate ourselves from the African self, causes troubles and causes the need to really exaggerate the small differences that we have from African neighbors. And so, like I mentioned, where we no longer feel that we can pinpoint our own strong individual identities, the fear of a loss of self is great, and we will do almost anything to regain the sense of certainty about who we are and how we are different from others. And so lastly, and I'll finish on that because I think I am out of time, when group identities become threatened, there's a number of rituals that individuals can engage in that's designed to protect the group identity, but particularly for our discussion today, one of these rituals is the ritual of purification, which Vamik Volkan describes as an increased effort to purge the group of contaminants from a dissimilar other, basically to remove the enemy other from the group and regain a strong individual identity or a strong identity of the group itself by removing all of these foreign elements from it. And this may include a drive to remove either foreign words or cultural elements from the group, but also in the more extreme cases, acts of violence that may culminate in ethnic cleansing and so forth. Right, so I'll just stop on that. I've summarized a few things that we can take from this presentation, which is basically just that individuals are so intimately connected to their large group, emotionally and psychologically.
I put your paper here.
Well, sorry.
You can continue.
All right, I'm finishing up in any way. So individuals are so intimately connected psychologically and emotionally to their in-group that they will do almost anything to preserve the image and the identity of the group, to keep it stable, secure, and specifically through difference. Right, and then when these identities become threatened, people may blow up the small differences that separate them from their in-group, which includes close allies, neighbors. This disrupts social relations, potentially leading to catastrophic consequences when people try to regain a sense of ontological security. And one way in which that ontological security is achieved then is through the elimination of what is seen as an external threat to the group's survival by the purification of the group from external elements. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Martina. It's actually, I need to really take notes. This is amazing. I really enjoyed your lecture. It shows that the University of the Free State Department of Politics is quite ahead. It's very, very, very beautiful summary. I could not have done it better, and I loved how you actually presented it to us. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you. Can I just ask that everyone who's on here, can you please just make sure that you mute your mic? Sometimes when the speaker is trying to get a point across, you know, when you're coming online, then you hear noise and then they stop. It just takes away the flow. We just heard a lecture from Dr. Bianca Naude, a senior lecturer from the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the University of the Free State. Her lecture was An Unbearable Likeness of Being, Ontological Insecurity and the Creation of Enemy Actors. I hope everyone who was able to hear it enjoyed it, and those who missed it and came on later, I believe that we are live on Facebook, so everyone will be able to get the lecture. Our next lecturer and presenter, who's going to give us something to chew on. Her lecture is Thinking Through Othering, Gender and Identity. Our lecturer is Professor Margot Rubin from the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of the Witwatersrand. Professor, can you please take it? I'm quite excited.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share screen because I've just got some images to flash up as we go through. So let me just put that through. Please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can all see it.
Great. Okay, let me just get into mode. Okay, let's start from the beginning. That's probably a good place to start, shall we? So thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about the idea of gender and how it is formulated and what it means in terms of context and how it's used to other certain kinds of people. So it's going to be at a very high level. It's going to be a very, very broad kind of discussion around this concept. So I'll take you through it. Okay. So as we all know, the last year has been absolutely life-changing. We've gone through a situation where life was proceeding as normal, and then out of the blue came this pandemic, and we were all hit by COVID. And through the COVID pandemic, what was really interesting was to watch the different responses by different leaders and by different people through the period of time. And what came out quite interestingly was this discussion around how different leaders have actually handled and interpreted the COVID responses. And for those of us who are interested in gender, we've been particularly interested in watching the media for conversations around female leadership and understanding what's been going on with female leadership. And these headlines have been coming up over and over again, and they say things like, what do countries with the best corona responses have in common? Women leaders. And which seems to be the case. I mean, if you look at Germany, Taiwan, New Zealand, all kinds of places, you certainly do get a really interesting set of statistics around the idea that that COVID deaths have been substantially lower in countries that have been led by women, have from women prime ministers or women presidents. Finland has only had 891, Iceland 29, New Zealand 26, which is tiny, Norway 709, and even Denmark with almost 2,500 is a relatively low figure considering some of the places. And then when one compares them to places where you've had serious autocratic male leadership, what we've seen is Brazil with 375,000, sorry, Daphne, the USA with almost 600,000, India with what I would assume is a vast underestimate of 180,000. And so what we started to see is this really interesting idea that somehow gender is making a difference in the way that men and women, male and female leaders are responding to the pandemic itself. And Forbes, in this article, did a really interesting analysis, and they said, well, actually what you can find is that there's a set of characteristics that have helped these different countries fight off the pandemic. And when you look at female leadership, it's actually female leadership has had a series of very specific characteristics that have allowed for these very low figures. And they started off with this really interesting analysis, and they said, well, the reasons behind female leadership being so effective has been because it's been decisive. It's been about telling the truth. It's been about an adoption of technology. And so for me, you know, as somebody who watches these things, I was like, oh, this is fantastic. This is a great analysis. It's fresh. It's interesting. It's really getting to some of the core of how how men and women in leadership positions differentiate, what the differences are. And I thought it was really positive. And then as I got toward the end of the article, it came out with this, and then it said, But one of the key things that happened was love, is that these prime ministers displayed love. They were able to show empathy and love, and they were responding. In this case of this particular prime minister from Norway, Anna Solberg, she was engaging with children. And suddenly I thought, oh, there we go. We're back in very well-trod territory. This we know all about. Here we go. We've got this interesting idea about women being associated with these maternal characteristics, with engaging with children, with being full of love. And I thought, oh, here we go. And then it became a little worse. And they said, well, female leaders generally show empathy and care, whereas male leaders have used the crisis to accelerate terrifying trifecta of authoritarianism, which the author identified as blaming others, capturing the judiciary, and demonizing journalists. So, you know, kind of thinking about this distinction between male and female leaders, and putting it very much as this idea that female leaders have been full of care and love and empathy, and male leaders have been kind of full of authoritarianism and despotism and very, very terrifying kind of acts of autocracy. So that's been really interesting. But then we get on to really another kind of analysis. And so other work that came out, which was also analyzing the differences between men and women and their leadership, turned around and said, well, actually, this is work coming out of the University of Liverpool and the University of Reading. It said that there are differences between men and women, but they're really interesting ones. There are differences in how men and women assess risk, with women being showing an ability to not underestimate risk and being less willing to engage with risk, particularly on behalf of other people. Women's leadership style tended to be more collaborative. And what we know from the governance literature is that collaboration has been key in terms of bringing different departments together to be able to address the pandemic itself, and better able to manage crises than men, with clear and decisive communication. And we've seen that there's one of the key things that's been going on in a lot of countries that have really failed at dealing with the pandemic, has been this idea that they've been kind of back and forthness, a blurriness, a lack of a real engagement. And so what we've seen with women leaders, apparently, according to the study, is that we've seen this clear and decisive communication. But let's go back and have a look at this for a moment. Let's think about what we're seeing and how we understand it. So on the one hand, what we've got is a set of very stereotypical notions around gender and how gender is portrayed even in female leaders. And on the second hand, what we do is we've got an interesting set of analyses which talk to a more kind of rational, a more analytical kind of understanding of why there's a difference between male and female leaders. And I think that both points are worth thinking about and worth considering. And both of them need to be thought through in terms of how we understand and construct gender as a formulation of othering, as a formulation of identity within both the politics of what goes on within the political frame, but also in society itself. So let's just think about that for 1 second. Now, traditional gender theory, and even somebody like myself, a radical feminist, tends to think about gender and sex in a very particular way. So we tend to think about sex as a biological kind of biological understanding. So they're biological attributes of human beings and of animals, so that if you have certain genitalia or if you have a certain genetic code, then this is what constitutes you as being male or female. And even then, a lot of us who are now working in the LGBTQI kind of space and are thinking about different notions are moving away from even this very biological determination of gender, seeing it as being incredibly problematic in and of itself. But so on the one hand, there's still this very kind of traditional notion of how we understand gender, linked to physicality, linked to biology, linked to the body. On the other hand, we understand gender to mean something quite different. Gender is what we perform. Gender is the socially accepted and socially constructed roles that people take on and perform in terms of acting like a man or acting like a woman. And for somebody like myself, we see a complete disconnect between the body, the biology, and the performance. And I would argue that really there's nothing particularly biological in the way that people choose to identify as being male or female, or alternatively gender fluid, non-binary, or whatever the other distinctions might be. And so we're moving away from this very, very clear kind of binary of male and female. But, okay, however, even though there is within certainly academic circles and LGBTQI circles, this movement away from this gender binary, it still persists in a number of different ways. We still see it as very much kind of structuring society. And so gender and the ideas around gender could basically detail how people should conform to their gender identity. And this has a whole lot of both moral, normative, and kind of implications around how people should act, about what they should do, around what their designated roles are, how they should operate, what jobs they should have. All kinds of different implications are associated and linked. And this is very clearly with what Bianca was talking about a few minutes ago, with this kind of socialized notion of identity. And how does it come to being? Well, it comes from everything we do and say, from signs and symbols that we put out and interpret on a daily basis. It's the language that we use. It's the notions that we inculcate in our children. It's the notions that we inculcate in ourselves. So, I mean, we see all these signs in a whole lot of different places. The clothes that are put out for kids are incredibly gendered, especially in South Africa. It's absolutely horrendous. So you see a situation where you've got T-shirts that say, "I'm too pretty to do maths," because, you know, girls can't do maths, of course. Or, you know, whereas boys' T-shirts say things like, "Large and in charge, be a hero," and girls' T-shirts say things like "mini diva." You see that in the toys that are given to children, with things like Junior Doctor in blue, clearly for a boy, and Little Nurse in pink, clearly for a girl. And so what you see in society, in very simplistic terms, is how a whole lot of signs and symbols, a whole lot of languages, a whole lot of way we think and behave construct these notions of gender and how boys and girls, and thus men and women, should behave. And we put onto it a set of normative judgments, which very clearly state that if you are somehow subversive, that somehow you refuse to behave in this way, your behavior is unacceptable. Your behavior is sanctioned. Your behavior cannot be accepted because you are not behaving according to how your gender has been interpreted. And so the gender itself becomes highly binary, it becomes binarized, becomes put into a binary of how men behave and how women behave. And so there's these very stereotypical notions, and I'm afraid to say they still very much exist, around the masculine being logical, rational, aggressive, strategic, independent, and men kind of taking on this role as being boss and decision maker. Women, on the other hand, are seen as being intuitive, emotional, submissive, very often sympathetic, cooperative, and very much in the kind of faithful and supportive role. And that's how these notions are kind of taken through. At the same time, the domestic is the realm of women, the working world is the realm of men. And these are how these ideas are kind of inculcated into people, and how their performance and how the ideas of what they should be doing is taken forward. But layered onto this, and something that we have to mention, is not just the idea of gender, it's also the idea of intersectionality. So, which is, how do we think about not just gender, but the other aspects of identity, which are part of human beings? So not just are people male or female, but what is their race? What is their socioeconomic position? What is their culture? What is their cultural ideas? And so these ideas then become layered onto this notion of intersectionality. They become they become hyphenated in terms of people's identity, so that one can't just make a comparison and say, well, all women bear the same, kind of characteristics or whatever else. Rather, the expectations of what constitutes femininity and what constitutes masculinity in any grouping or any society is also constituted by the kind of cultural situation in which they exist, by their socioeconomic position, by their temporality, by the time in which they exist. Because as we know, these things change with time. What is acceptable today was not acceptable, or was acceptable 20 years ago is not acceptable today. What was accepted 100 years ago will certainly not be accepted today in terms of gender behavior. And so we start to see that there are notions about how we understand gender itself, how it is constructed, how it is performed, and the fact that it is very much inculcated in the way that people will see themselves, how they identify, and how they choose to behave to a large degree. But this stuff sounds fairly esoteric. I mean, why does it matter? Why do we care if men are seen as being logical and women are seen as being emotional? Surely this is a good thing. I mean, women are emotional. Emotions are fantastic. Logic is fantastic. Why don't we kind of ascribe to the separate but equal kind of constitution of identity? Well, for people like me who are really interested in this idea of gender, it matters quite a lot. And it matters at a variety of scales, from the very personal, from the very intimate scale of our bodies, all the way through to the scale of cities, the scale of everyday behavior. So it works all the way up from how we operate in our own bodies, to how we operate within our own households, to how we operate within our own communities, to how we operate within our own cities and the decisions that we make. And so this is why we think it's important. So, for example, the idea of gender literally constructs and needs to be thought about in the way that we think about what is an acceptable female versus male body. And that has implications for how people behave, how they dress, or what is acceptable dress, what is considered beautiful, what is considered ugly, what is considered to be in some way okay for people to do and to look like, and what is not. It determines the codes of behavior and what is not acceptable, or how we see it in the way that it's very interesting. We see it in the way that men and women use language, that very, very kind of deterministic, very kind of concrete terms are generally used by men, whereas women tend to ask more questions. They tend to phrase things as questions. So that becomes an acceptable way. Women who don't choose to operate in that mode are often seen as being pushy. They're seen as being aggressive. They're seen as being bossy. They're seen as being all kinds of different things.
So Rubin, if you could just tilt the camera down a little bit, just over your face.
Oh, can't even see what I'm doing. Let me.
Perfect.
Is that good?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much. So it determines, and so it tells us what kind of acceptable behavior is acceptable. Men, for example, who choose not to use that kind of mode of communication tend to be seen as wimps or as feminized, or as not being acceptable in their behavior. Their sexuality is questioned, their performance is questioned, their entire masculinity is questioned, and as such their identity is questioned. And so how we understand these notions of gender is very much also related to how we understand notions of sexuality. So that the way that male and female men and women perform their sexuality, and the kind of standard heteronormative ideology that this is what people should do. Men and women should behave in this particular way. This is how sex should be done. This is how sexuality should be performed, and anything outside of that is considered subversive to it. Even the notions of what constitutes a good mother and a good father, and this is work that we've been doing quite a lot at the moment, is constituted by this idea of gender. So a good father is a man who provides, is a man who goes out and searches for work, is a man who is a good role model for his father. He's the head of the family. Whereas a good mother is emotional. She's emotionally available. She does the emotional heavy lifting. She cooks dinner. She's in charge of the domestic realm. And still we see these really stereotypical, really conventional notions of gender still playing out in a number of different ways. And then we see it very much in the issues of control. And this is a key issue, control and power. And what we understand is that there's the notion that men should be in control. They should be in control of themselves, of their bodies, of their households, of their communities, of their countries. They should be in control of companies. And so what we see is the notion.
My apologies, Professor. You've gone over the time. Can you please conclude?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I hate to be the man that is coming in as if I'm controlling.
No worries. Okay. Basically, just to give I'm going to give two real life examples, and then I'm going to finish off if that's okay.
Yes, that's okay.
Cool. Good. So basically, when we take these examples into reality, I mean, what we see is that we have, for example, 47 out of 500 companies that have female CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. What we see is that there are only 336 female billionaires in the world. What we see is that only 14% of engineers worldwide are female. And what we see is that only a tiny minority of men constitute nursery and primary school teachers. What we see is a situation where we have low rates of employment and literacy for women in certain kinds of countries, which means that they don't earn their own money. This means that men become the sole providers for their households. We see it in the way that cities are planned, and that cities are seen as being gendered, where suburbs are the spaces of women and CBDs the spaces of men. And we see it very much in gender-based violence, with the idea that, and particularly in South Africa, where there's a crisis in masculinity because men have lost this identity of being providers, of being the heads of their households. And so there's a crisis of masculinity leading to all kinds of violence and all kinds of gender-based violence, rape, and domestic abuse. So this is why it matters. Gender and constructing gender is problematic, not just for women and what it does to women, but also for men, in terms of how it locks people into these identities, how it makes sure that they're discriminated against both by themselves and the societies in which they operate. And that is why it's problematic. I'm so sorry to have gone over, and I apologize.
No problem, Prof. Actually, you assisted quite a lot. I think if there are, I'm not sure how many South Africans are here, all of us know about the gender-based violence problem that we are having. It's actually a scourge. It's quite terrible, and it's quite insightful to actually understand where it's coming from. I think knowledge builds societies, and you've given us the type of knowledge that we actually do need to actually spread throughout our communities. I've never actually looked at it like the way that you presented, which we actually humbly thank you, Professor Margot Rubin.
No problem, thank you.
So the lecture that we just got was by Professor Margot Rubin. She's from the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of the Witwatersrand, or Wits University. Her lecture was Thinking Through Othering, Gender and Identity. Now we will be moving on to the next lecture. I hope everyone is putting the questions, because we've been going through a lot of information. I hope everyone is having the question. I have a few burning questions that I also would put in the chat box, just to make sure that we're actually exploring some of these topics that we have. Our next lecturer will be Dr. Hussein Solomon, who is the head of the Department of Political Science, the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the University of the Free State. His lecture is titled Exploring Xenophobia in the Rainbow Nation. Wow, actually, Dr. Hussein, wow. I think, yeah, I really am opening up my ears for this lecture. I think it's one of the burning issues after Professor Margot's presentation. This is one of the issues that we actually we're unable as South Africans to actually stop. So I think it's quite important.
Thank you
Dr.
very
Hussein?
much. Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you, Vuyo. I think that xenophobic violence has been a feature of post-apartheid South Africa, although it should be said that the first xenophobic attacks that were recorded were in 1982, interestingly in Gazankulu. So what you see this in terms of the spaza shops of foreigners constantly being looted and set alight, as well as the gruesome murder of foreign migrants through the act of necklacing. And what's interesting here is that various surveys have indicated that South Africans of all social classes are in favor of more restrictive measures against foreign migrants. A survey by the Human Sciences Research Council demonstrated that only 20% of South Africans are open to immigration, and others want either no immigration or various forms of restriction imposed upon them. And while xenophobia is a global phenomenon, the form it takes in South Africa is highly racialized, directed at fellow Black Africans. The occurrence of xenophobia in South Africa is difficult to understand, given the fact that South Africa's economic prosperity was built on the backs of migrant laborers, many from neighboring countries. Moreover, SADC states, the Southern African Development Community, not only gave refuge to members of the liberation movements, as in the ANC and the PAC, but they also bore the brunt of apartheid destabilization, attacks and invasions of their countries, as well as support for rebel movements, for instance, UNITA in Angola and Renamo in Mozambique. The emergence of democratic South Africa in 1994 was to herald a new rainbow nation where differences were celebrated and where discrimination of whatever form was to end. Despite the progressive tone of the South African Constitution, this was not realized. Now, studies on xenophobia have attributed such hatred of foreigners to a number of causes: the fear of loss of social status and identity, a threat perceived or real to citizens' economic success, a way of reassuring the national self and its boundaries in times of crisis, a feeling of superiority, and of course, poor intercultural information. Various studies have indicated that xenophobia grows rampant where poverty and unemployment exists. The shrinking South African economy therefore holds the risk of further xenophobic violence. In 2020, half of the adult population lived in poverty if one takes the upper bound poverty line of 1,183 Rand per month. With the pandemic and resultant lockdown levels, poverty levels have increased in this most unequal society in the world. In this context, the number of xenophobic incidents in the country has increased, from Khayelitsha to Katlehong and from Durban to Hope Bay. Over 500 foreign nationals have lost their lives as a result of such xenophobic violence since 2008. Hatred and bitterness towards Black Africans, whose marginal and vulnerable status makes them easy targets, allows Black South Africans to ward off the feeling that their struggle for democracy has not fulfilled expectations, and to tell them that at the very least it allows them to differentiate themselves from the backward others, the so-called amakwere, as foreign African migrants are derogatively referred to. Harris refers to the scapegoating process, where unfulfilled expectations of a new democracy result in the foreigner coming to embody unemployment, poverty, and deprivation. It is perceptions of economic harm caused by foreign migrants which is fueling xenophobia. Hard facts and figures, however, contradict these perceptions. Over 40% of respondents in one survey believe that foreign citizens should be denied South African citizenship because they cause economic harm. In the same survey, however, almost 60% had never heard of anyone who was denied a job because it went to a foreigner, and over 70% had no personal knowledge or experience of such an occurrence. In addition, research conducted on migrant entrepreneurs in Gauteng demonstrated that small, medium, and micro enterprises and hawking operations create an average of 3 jobs per business, which directly challenges the view that immigrants, particularly street traders, reduce the number of jobs available for South Africans. Another common perception is that foreign migrants are driving the country's rocketing crime rates. Again, this is a case of it being far easier to blame the intolerable crime rates on illegal immigrants than to tackle the social causes of the problem. Such perceptions are rarely supported by any statistical evidence. Crime figures showed that over 90% of arrests were of South Africans, and the percentage of foreigners rarely exceeded 1% in any crime category, further exemplifying the power of perception and the need for education to fight xenophobia. This in turn raises the question as to how these perceptions arise. According to various surveys, the main sources of information regarding migrants have been television, followed by radio, personal interaction, and newspapers. This suggests that the mass media are placed in a strategic position to inform opinion on migration and to deal with problems associated with xenophobia. Research conducted on South African media found that whilst reporting is not racist, as such, representations of foreigners are largely of a negative bias and extremely unanalytical in nature, as a majority of the press has tended to reproduce problematic research and anti-migrant terminology uncritically. Consider, for instance, the term alien. This has been sharply criticized by the United Nations. Moreover, such a term as alien hardly distinguishes between migrants, immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees with the attendant legal obligations. Now, the term alien is unfortunate since it suggests that migrants do not belong. It also implies difference, strangeness, and, to link back with Dr. Bianca Naude, otherness. Of course, the term alien stems from South Africa's 1991 Aliens Control Act, which was amended in 95 and 96, and Human Rights Watch has correctly labeled it as an archaic piece of apartheid legislation at odds with international human rights norms and the South African Constitution. Now, this is the interesting thing. The act has its roots in the 1937 Aliens Act, which was intended to exclude German Jews fleeing Nazi persecution from coming to South Africa. Now, if journalists are to be more circumspect in their reporting, what about members of the ruling African National Congress? Since the presidency of Thabo Mbeki, members of the ruling party have not wished to confront the reality of xenophobia in the country, preferring to label it criminal violence by a minority. This despite various surveys indicating the prevalence of xenophobic attitudes across large sections of the population. Perhaps more to the point is how the ruling party have contributed to xenophobia. An ANC MP, Desmond Lockie, notably stated, and I'm quoting him, "There are few countries in the world which would extend human rights to non-citizens," unquote. Perhaps the Honorable Lockie is unaware of South Africa's international legal obligations pertaining to the 1951 UN Convention on the Status of Refugees, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the 1960 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the 1990 International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Family. In 2015, the Gauteng Health MEC, Mahlangu, blamed the province's failing health systems on immigrants, stating without any evidence that 9/10 of patients in public hospitals and clinics were immigrants. In similar vein, Dr. Aaron Matsoledi, then Health Minister and now Home Affairs Minister, also blamed plummeting health provision on foreign migrants who are admitted in large numbers, saying that they cause overcrowding and infection control starts falling. Responding to these remarks, Savo Helata of the Nelson Mandela University noted, why would politicians choose to face the rightful anger of millions of poor and hopeless South Africans when they can revert to anti-migrant rhetoric and shift the blame to those who have no voice? In the face of international condemnation, including from fellow African countries, Pretoria has adopted the National Action Plan that aims to resolve the challenges confronting non-nationals residing in the country. However, like so much else in South Africa, there's hardly any monitoring and scarcely any implementation. According to Christy Ueda of Human Rights Watch, launching the national plan was a positive step, but clearly more urgent, concrete measures are needed to end violence, police harassment, and impunity. Protecting non-nationals from further attacks and ending xenophobic violence requires a long-term strategy and not just words on paper. I cannot agree more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein Solomon. We just had a lecture from Dr. Hussein Solomon, the head of the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the University of Free State. His lecture was exploring xenophobia in the Rainbow Nation. Dr. Hussein Solomon, actually, you still have some time, but I was actually perplexed by how you were able to actually connect things that even our government does not want to connect, and how you actually just showed how our history And what is presently happening is actually quite linked. It's kind of ironic that they are using apartheid laws in a democratic country to oppress people who were once our brothers in arms and our sisters in arms. It's quite disturbing for, I think, anyone here who just listened to your lecture to actually hear how a law created by the apartheid government is being used right now within a democratic dispensation. It's actually quite disheartening.
Well, I mean, one of the most interesting things for me has been, if you look at the 2008, I mean, ultimately, all these kinds of forms of discrimination that we've been talking about is all intertwined. And what was interesting for me was the 2008 xenophobic attacks. And when it started, you know, it was directed against foreigners. But then it started to be directed towards particular ethnic groups. For example, if you're Venda and so forth. And that's the thing. When you start with it, where does it stop? But fundamentally, the government has not been able to deal with this because they don't want to actually take responsibility for it, I think. And as I said, foreigners are a convenient scapegoat. And of course, what's really contradictory is South Africa, you know, under Thabo Mbeki was pushing for the African Renaissance. Okay. We've been talking about this Continental Free Trade Association. SADC has been talking about the free movement of labor. And all of these things, you know, contradict what's happening on the ground. But part of the problem is not the political will to actually challenge it and to call it out, rather saying, no, this is just a group of now criminals involved in this. And this, for me, is problematic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solomon. That was quite insightful. Actually, wow. I learned a lot from that. Now we'll be moving to our next lecturer. There's actually a friend who spent a lot of time at Wits at the stairs next to the Wharton Weiler Library. This is Mighti Jamie, an independent African analyst and podcaster. His lecture is Race, Discourse, the Academic and Public Divide. Please, Jamie, share.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I do have fond memories of the multiple debates we had on campus about a variety of issues. The title of my talk is Racial Discourse, the Academic Public Divide. The reason why I chose this particular topic is because I have noticed, and I think it is notable, that there is a divide that is occurring between the academic circles and the discourse that is happening on the issues of race and issues of racism, and the discussions that are happening in social platforms and in person platforms. So before I go on, I just want to point out the significance of the moment wherein we are having these kind of discussions. We're having these discussions in a moment just now where the Derek Chauvin verdict has been handed in. And if you recall, late in March of 2020, the video footage was captured of Derek Chauvin actually killing, and now it has been determined that that was a criminal act, killing George Floyd. And that is the context wherein we have this discussion. We're having this discussion in a context where there is a lot of anxiety around discussions of race, and there has been a polarization of the discussions of race. And there are two scenarios wherein we are having a divide in the discourse on race. Scenario number one is the discrediting of legitimate academic discourse on race happening in public forums. And scenario number 2 is the discrediting of legitimate public voices on racial discourse in academic circles. And I'll go into each of those in turn, and then towards the end discuss the harm that can exist from a continuation of this divide. And maybe it's food for thought for everyone to consider, how do we close that gap and how do we improve the quality of our discourse? I mean, fundamentally, we cannot have reformed policy and we cannot achieve social cohesion whilst the two discussions happen in silos and while one silo becomes a toxic space for the discussion. So the first example that I want to bring up of this divide happening is that if you have been paying attention, you will have noted that there has been an attempt in America to start teaching what has been called anti-bias training in primary and high schools, as we would define them, through the lens of critical race theory. And late last year, even during the presidential debates, Donald Trump was one of the people who pointed out that critical race theory is something that is problematic and something that he doesn't want to be taught in schools. And specifically what he did is that he issued a directive which ended all academic training or all anti-bias training, which was based on critical race theory. And then other people within the American social discourse space took up this attack on critical race theory. They then continued to be a discrediting of critical race theory. Locally, there is a book that is either coming out or is already out by Helen Zille, which is titled Go Woke, Stay Broke. And in this book and in the discourse around this book and in that community, there's also a localized attack on critical race theory. And what this does is that it ignores or it undercuts the history of critical race theory as an academic body of knowledge. I mean, Priscilla Ocean, who is the professor at Loyola Law School, she provides a definition of critical race theory as the academic and activist pursuit of a society that is just, egalitarian, and inclusive. And the real background of critical race theory is that, I mean, for those who are not familiar with some of this, is that it was a development on top of another theory of academic thought, which was called critical legal theory. So several scholars and thinkers, one who is acknowledged for pushing forward and being one of the founders of critical race theory is a professor named Derek Bell. Professor Derek Bell was the first tenured professor who was Black at Harvard. And in the late 70s, he actually started developing critical race theory as an extension of critical legal theory. And there are several other prominent thinkers who have been associated with the development of the academic body of knowledge. Richard Delgado, Jen Stefanaski come into mind. And what we have seen is that even though in the academic literature and in the academic school of thought and in the historical development of knowledge, there is a robust and peer-reviewed body of knowledge that has been built up called critical race theory. Now what we've seen is that prominent public entities, politicians have been able to go into the public forum and say this body of knowledge actually is not a credible body of knowledge, and tried to impute on critical race theory this idea that it is sham intellectualism without actually engaging with the academic body of work. The challenge that exists is that those people have massive platforms and audiences, and most people will only ever know about critical race theory from the critique of people such as Donald Trump and popular YouTube sensations such as Ben Shapiro, who, while speaking in platforms with authority and with large audiences do not do the academic work of engaging the literature and existing academic body of knowledge from critical race theorists. And in fact, they do a very pedestrian engagement with the content. That is one example where there's a divide between the public discourse and the actual academic community, because the academic community that has built this body of work on critical race theory has not been able to effectively correct the misconceptions being created by prominent figures about what they have actually worked on and what they have done. And most people would actually agree with the field of knowledge, don't even know what it is that they disagree with. They've just been told critical race theory is creating wokeism and snowflakes. And because of that, they believe that this theory is not a credible one. That's one. Another example of the divide is what happened, and I think this one is closer to home, with former Wits University Vice Chancellor and the director of the London University School of Oriental and African Studies. The details of the events, just to quickly go over them, is that the professor had made a statement which students did not appreciate, and when there was engagement on that from the students and from the public community, what then happened is that we had South African academics write a letter and demand that, you know, the academic be reinstated, and they made this argument in the public discourse. In this particular instance, what we saw was several prominent academics disagreeing with the public, disagreeing with students, disagreeing with the arguments that had been made by students without necessarily engaging with the merits of what students had articulated. Curiously, when students and public society had pushed back on the use of this problematic word by the academic in question, they actually based their academic rationale on the teachings of Professor Walter Rodney, who was a graduate, a PhD graduate from the very same institution, the London University School of African and Oriental Studies. So even though the public was using the arguments of Dr. Walter Rodney, or Professor Walter Rodney rather, even though they were articulating his argument made almost 50, 60 years ago, the academics who were engaging with them were not engaging with them in the spirit of what the public was saying. Not to belabor the examples, both of these instances show a divide in the discourse on race, a divide in the discourse on appropriate responses to instances or occurrences of events that people may deem to have been racist or anything related to that. I want to outline that without addressing this divide, the conversation is likely to become more adverse and more toxic, because the nature of discourse now is that it has become more democratized, and thus academics do not hold the same monopoly on intellectual discourse that they enjoyed before the proliferation of social media platforms and the internet, which has allowed people to make blogs, websites, YouTube accounts, Twitter accounts. And those people now contest the traditional academic for the attention and for the cognitive window or the discursive window. Having said that, it's therefore important for the academic community to think about how do we avoid both scenarios. The scenario where correct and credible academic thinking is being rubbished in the public fora to the detriment of the discussion. That's something that you don't want. But you also don't want a situation where academics are behind legitimate thinking on social discourse. and are at odds with the people driving legitimate discourse on social discourse. So I think that's the scenario that we find ourselves in right now, where legitimate academic work is being discredited and legitimate social commentary is being discredited. And it's not a good place to be for the progression of knowledge and for the progression of discourse. So I'll leave it there because I don't want to go over time. I'm aware that there have been some constraints with time. So it's food for thought that I want to leave the audience with in terms of how do we close this divide and how do we improve the quality of our discourse on race in ways that are inclusive of the public voice, but not dismissive of the academic body of work that predates this current moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mighti Jamie. From our discussions in undergrad, we're still discussing the same things, which is quite ironic. But I think progress is a very, very, very slow process from what we've seen. Our featured lecturer was Mighti Jamie, who is an independent African analyst and podcaster. His lecture was Racial Discourse, the Academic and Public Divide. Thank you very much, Jamie. It's always good to actually get your point of view. I know on Twitter you are being screenshot a lot lately with your various opinions, which sometimes for a lot of people aren't popular, but in most cases are true. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm actually honored to actually ask the next featured lecturer to come on. He's been a person with a lot of encouragement. I see him as a mentor. And one day I wish to reach the heights and actually even have the optimism that he has in a lot of the issues that we deal with. We sometimes get discouraged as young people, but to actually meet a giant who has been willing to place some of us young people on his shoulders is quite encouraging. Our featured lecturer is Dr. Charles Asher Small, the Executive Director of ISGAP, Research Scholar at St. Antony's College. His lecture is Antisemitism and the Reactionary Historical Revision of Apartheid and the People's Struggle. Over to you, Dr.
So, thank you very much, Vuyo, for a very kind introduction. Professor Hussein Solomon and Benji Schulman and the panelists, thank you very much for being here and putting this important program together. I'm really honored to be here, and my colleagues at ISGAP are as well. I'm going to start briefly, if I may, with sort of a personal comment. It was in the mid-1980s. I was a student at McGill University, and I took a course with Professor Sam Newmoff. It was called Comparative Revolution. And he gave a lecture on apartheid South Africa. And I was a young, I guess, naive student. And I went up to him after class and I asked him naively, when did apartheid end? And he told me it hadn't ended. And I was shocked. And I said, when do you think it would end? When would this racist, fascist, Nazi-like regime come to an end? And at the time, he said he wasn't sure, that the regime was still firmly entrenched. And I couldn't believe it, that in my lifetime, a regime that was based on racism, that was reminiscent of the Nazi era, that still existed in my time, shocked me. I grew up in Montreal in a Jewish community that had a disproportionate amount of Holocaust survivors. My grandparents and their generation they were fortunate to come to Canada as refugees, and many of our extended family were murdered and certainly displaced in the Holocaust. And I grew up in a community that believed never again. And I was the first generation of young Jewish students that were able to have access to universities and to a future through study if we worked, which my grandparents and even my parents did not enjoy. So this experience led me on a path, and to make a long story short, I became active in the anti-apartheid movement. I became the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada, and was active internationally, and had the privilege of being in South Africa in the 1980s and 90s as part of the struggle against the fascist, racist regime of South Africa and of the apartheid South Africa, and had the good fortune of meeting incredible people along the way and spending time in places throughout South Africa, from Fort Hare University to Khayelitsha and many other places in my experiences, and they altered and changed my life. So I'm particularly honored to be here for this conference with colleagues in South Africa, in a free South Africa. And yet at the same time, my comrades and colleagues, as we know, that South Africa and this notion of apartheid in 2021 has become, in my view, hijacked by people that are demonizing the Jewish people, demonizing the state of Israel, demonizing Zionism, and are at the forefront of contemporary anti-Semitism. And I'll explain this in my presentation as briefly as I can. So very quickly, anti-Semitism, I'm going to give you the history of anti-Semitism in 60 seconds, so please forgive me for being crude. But anti-Semitism, in the words of Professor Robert Wistrich and others, is a form of hatred which is inherently genocidal. It's a form of hatred when the colonial powers went to Africa and went to the Americas to exterminate and displace and control people. As they were leaving Europe to conquer parts of the world and to classify people in this sort of racist, subhuman categories, which they did, that anti-Semitism was at the forefront. The foundations of racism and colonialism came out of the European experience and came out of its perspective and view of the Jew and of the other. So I think when we struggle against racism in the contemporary context, we have to understand the underpinnings of these inhumane classifications, these dehumanizing classifications, come out of a civilization which was at the forefront of exterminating and displacing the other. And the quintessential other in the European civilization, in my view, was the Jew. So anti-Semitism has three phases. One was religion, later race, and now the demonization of who Jews are as a people. So when it came to religion, the Jews were the other. The Jews were the stubborn other that did not accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, still holding on to their culture, their heritage, their worldview. And what made anti-Semitism genocidal is that the Jew, by not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah, was doomed to darkness, was doomed to being unable to be saved. And what makes anti-Semitism genocidal is that it wasn't just a problem for the individual Jew for not accepting the Christian European notion of the Savior, but that the Jew, the stubborn Jew, was holding up the redemption of the world. So it wasn't just the redemption of the individual that was at stake, but by the Jews not accepting the Christian notion, they were holding back world redemption. And in order to have world redemption, the Jew had to be converted, civilized, or exterminated. When the worldview shifted from religion, or the dominant worldview shifted from religion to notions of biology and race and science and eugenics, the Jew was perceived as a poisoning race, as a dirty race, as a race that was poisoning the purity of the white Aryan nation and race. And unlike the religious form of anti-Semitism, where the Jew had the option to convert and to be saved, race was something, as Herder and other so-called philosophers coming out of Europe, race was something that was inherent. It was deep within the character of an individual, one that you could not escape, one that you cannot change. So this form of racist anti-Semitism led to the notion that the Jew had to be removed. It was a stain on the white Aryan race and had to be removed, and the Jews were either exiled, or which this notion led ultimately to the Holocaust and the extermination of the Jewish race to save the purity of the white Aryan race. And we know in South Africa, there is a legacy of both of these forms of anti-Semitisms during the apartheid era. But now in progressive liberal institutions like universities and the media of record, these forms of anti-Semitisms, although one of our colleagues in South Africa recently praised Hitler, I understand, that these types of anti-Semitisms are largely unacceptable. And I think if anyone articulates these old Christian or racist forms of anti-Semitisms, they're usually ostracized, and these types of ideas are no longer accepted in these liberal circles. But to demonize the Jewish people, to demonize the reestablishment, not the establishment, but the reestablishment of the Jewish homeland of Israel, that this form of demonization and anti-Semitism is not only tolerated, but I would say in liberal progressive circles, it's actually encouraged. In fact, if you're a good Jew, or if you're a progressive person struggling in local struggles or the international struggle, it's a badge that you have to pass. If you're a good Jew, you have to be critical of our primitive religion and culture, and most certainly of the Zionist entity. And again, this type of anti-Semitism will lead to not only the demonization of who Jews are as a people and the homeland of the Jewish people, but this also, in order to save the world, people believe that this entity has to be dismantled. And if Israel is a racist, fascist, colonial, apartheid entity, from a liberal human rights perspective, this entity has to be dismantled. So the BDS movement, the boycott movement, which is at the forefront of progressive struggles against fascism and racism, call for the elimination of the State of Israel. And this, in my view, ladies and gentlemen, is the contemporary dominant form of anti-Semitisms or anti-Semitisms which exist. And it's ironic that in the American context, where we're struggling against police brutality and deep-seated violent racism, that now people, some of the leadership of the Black Lives Matter, I think Black Lives Matter is an organic movement that has risen out of horrific police brutality and segregation and racism, but the leadership, or some of the leadership, are actually now articulating notions that the Jews are the quintessential white elitists and are part of the problem, that the Israelis are training American police officers to harm and shoot young African-American people in the United States. So the demonization and the discourse around Israel is very strong. And it's ironic that people are now classifying in the United States and in progressive circles internationally that the Jew is the quintessential white elitist racist. So in a short period of time, people of my grandparents' generation, people who were hunted and exterminated and removed from Europe, I'm speaking of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, we were exterminated because we were not white. And now the Jewish people are being labeled as white, not not because people are apologetic and saying sorry for what happened in the past and now welcome to the club, but no, on the contrary, Jews are being labeled as white, as the enemy of progressive international movement, and Israel is being portrayed as such. And I would like to just speak briefly to the words of Edward Said and Michel Foucault. Edward Said and Michel Foucault are very important in this sort of philosophical postmodern moment. Edward Said and Michel Foucault, it should be stated, were in France in exile with exiled leaders of the Iranian revolutionary regime in the 1970s and 80s, and they saw the Iranian revolutionary regime or the movement of the mullahs as something akin to French Enlightenment. They saw that what was happening and unfolding with the Iranian revolutionary regime and movement, that this was going to usher in sort of an Islamic Enlightenment era. And people like Foucault and Said were never critical of the excesses of the Iranian revolutionary regime, this movement that emerges out of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Sunni world, and then some of those ideas are imported into the Iranian revolutionary regime. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Iranian revolutionary regime, if you look at the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, Qutb and al-Banna and others, literally take European anti-Semitism and even fascism, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was the foundation of 19th and 20th century anti-Semitism. It speaks of a cabal, of a Jewish conspiracy to control the world. And if you look at the writings of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Hamas Charter, they literally plagiarize the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and this plays a critical role in the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. This sort of old European anti-Semitism, genocidal anti-Semitism, fused with a very narrow notion of Islam. So I'm not speaking about Islam or Muslims, and it's a very important distinction, but the reactionary social movement of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Iran, of the Iranian regime, takes European anti-Semitism and even Nazism and fascism and fuses it with this reactionary political movement, the Muslim Brotherhood. So you have this sort of red-green alliance that is taking place in the world, and it's taking place to some extent in South Africa. So we look at how Edward Said took the Frankfurt School, took Adorno and Horkheimer, and I'd like to thank the great work of a colleague of mine, William Kohlbrenner, and I'm quoting from some of his work. So in the most general sense, the dialectics of enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer's work, the Frankfurt School, which is an important conceptual approach that progressive or critical scholarship is using in this moment. So in the most general sense, they perceived enlightenment as a way of liberating men, and I'm using the word deliberately, men, sorry, not women, but men, from fear of and establishing sovereignty. Yet the fully enlightened earth radiates disaster and triumph. The program of enlightenment was the disenchantment of the world, the disillusion of myths, and the substitute of knowledge from fantasy. It was supposed to be progressive. Reason itself, the main item of the heritage of positive classicalism, is the decline or the eclipse, but it's also the source of the eclipse. The application of reason to society through science, democratization, industrialization, involving the progressive dominant of nature through technology and commercial expansion, also tragically entails the progressive domination over people as well. So I think this is important to see how modernity has been used in a way to dominate different populations around the world, or in the sort of post-colonial moment. Edward Said wrote that we deduce from Adorno. So Adorno and the Frankfurt School is really dominated by a group of refugees that fled the Holocaust. These were Jewish intellectuals in Germany and in Europe who fled the Holocaust, and they write about how Auschwitz potentially, as Adorno wrote, potentially marks the end of enlightenment and marks the end of democracy and even European civilization. So Said says that by virtue of living a life according to different norms, the intellectual does not have a story, but only a sort of a destabilizing effect. He sets off seismic shocks, he jolts people, but he can neither be explained away by his background nor his friends. This is from the Representations of Intellectuals of Edward Said. Of course, and I'm quoting Said, the last Jewish he said, I'm quoting Said now, of course, I'm the last Jewish intellectual. Said says this. You don't know anyone else. All of your other Jewish intellectuals are now suburban squires, from Amos Oz to all those people here in America. So I'm the last one, the only true follower of Adorno. Let me put it this way. I'm a Jewish Palestinian. The Frankfurt School critical theory, despite its insights into relationships between domination, modernity, and opportunities for redemption through art as critique, is stunning. Silent on racist theory, anti-imperial resistance, and opposition practice to the empire. So in a sense, I'll just make one more quote from Said. One thing I want to remember is that the more he shores up the sphere of Exodus politics, the more likely it is that the Canaanites from the outside will resist and try to penetrate the walls, banning them from the goods. What it is. You can perhaps more easily feel compassion, more easily call injustice, more easily speak directly and plainly of all the oppression, and with less difficulty try to understand his story and equality. So Said, in a sense, he then goes on to speak about Gaza as an open-air prison and likens it to Auschwitz. So here, Said is basically doing what Christianity does, in a sense, in this sort of replacement theory. Said becomes the last Jewish intellectual, the last witness to Auschwitz in his condemnation of the Zionist racist apartheid entity. And this is sort of the underpinnings of this philosophical moment we have in universities and in so-called progressive social movements. So I want to move from this to speak about respecting the other. And I work on notions of otherness, and I'm informed by the great work of Emmanuel Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas writes that we need the other to be human. And Emmanuel Levinas famously said that when you look into the face of the other, when you see your face in the face of the other, this is the instant you become human. So when you see yourself in the face of the other, this is when you're human. We need the other to be human. So our relationship to the other must be ethical. And if we're ethical towards the other, then we are human. So we need the other. So there's not a notion of tolerance, but of humility. We don't accept the other begrudgingly or from a position of superiority, but we need the other to be human. So if we're sexist, we eliminate more than 50% of the global population to learn from. If we're racist, if I'm against people of African origin, I lose 1 billion opportunities to become an ethical human being. So being racist, being sexist, being opposed to any notion of otherness limits ourselves as human beings. So this is a very powerful, I think, understanding of our need to live and work with the other. And what Emmanuel Levinas does, in my view, he takes Jewish ethics, Jewish thought, and he brings it to the university. And I think this is a very important model, in a sense, in our work. And I'm reminded of the work of Stephen Biko, the writings of Stephen Biko, where he speaks so powerfully and eloquently about African culture, about African cosmology, and of an African worldview, and how in the Black consciousness movement there was a need to educate people in the struggle and to have pride and understanding of their heritage and culture in the struggle. And so my question is, in 2021, is it possible to have universities that not only accept in South Africa, in the United States, and in other parts of the world, Black people or brown people or non-Christian white people into the universities, but can universities actually be a space and a place where different cultures and different ideas are not only tolerated, but taught in the university? Are we still, in a sense, being colonized by perceiving the dynamics and the challenges of our time in categories and with a worldview that comes out of this colonial, racist, anti-Semitic, and sexist worldview? So this to me is a challenge. And I think in terms of the hijacking of the apartheid history, and I say this with humility because I'm not from South Africa, but as a Jewish person, if I may say that, if I may have that identity in an academic conversation, as a Jewish person, the reestablishment of the State of Israel, not the establishment of the State of Israel, but the reestablishment of the State of Israel. 2,000 years ago, Rome, a European entity, colonized and conquered Israel and dispersed the Jewish people around the world. And now, in a sense, the reestablishment of Israel and the ingathering of the Jewish people from Europe, from North Africa, from the Middle East, and increasingly from other parts of the world. And I would just also like to say that I had Passover. Pesach was a couple of weeks ago, the Jewish holiday that celebrates the exodus from slavery, the exodus from Egypt, where the Jewish people became a nation. I had Passover in Nigeria. I had Passover in Nigeria with a group of African Jewish people. And it was an amazing experience for me, seeing this sort of veneer of colonialism being removed in front of my ignorant eyes, and sharing a holiday with African Jewish people who trace their heritage to Israel of many centuries ago and many generations ago, still practicing a culture and a worldview that is different than what a colonial worldview teaches me and others of what Jewish identity is, or even what African identity is. So for me, this was a very powerful moment. And I think, in a sense, if we can get back to understanding the incredible cultures that exist in Africa and in other parts of the world, cultures that have deep ideas and deep heritage and traditions of wisdom. And can we get to a space where we can get above and beyond notions of race, of nation, in a deep way, and really begin to have a conversation with the other, and to see the other, and to displace the colonial racist worldview, which is still dominant in our discourse. It's still dominant in how we perceive each other. It's still dominant in the conversations and the concepts that we have to use in spaces like this to have an intellectual conversation. And I would submit to you that in order to overcome, and literally overcome, the barriers to become fully human, to see the humanity, to see ourselves in the face of the other with humility, and to have conversations where we can create a better society, a better world, where we truly respect not only the other, but ourselves, and that we are free to have conversations that draw upon ideas and concepts of respect and humility that run deep, that can create dialogue and can create a space where we can overcome these boundaries and identities of superiority and inferiority, based on gender, based on race, based on religion. And I think for me, this is the challenge. And I think now with technology and communications that we can begin for the first time in centuries to have a deep conversation and to expand the points of reference and our concepts of perceiving truth and perceiving each other. So I'll end there, and happy to engage in a conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Small. It was very insightful. You always have a way of bringing everything together. I think it's only proper that we actually have a quote from Steve Biko for us to actually find the type of thinking that he had, and actually, because we are talking about the topics that men like Steve Biko fought and died for. And I think it's important that after going through so much about identity, the other, and just humanity as a whole, that we do actually start to find the type of ideas that actually brought us here. I know that you, Dr. Small, were hugely influenced by Steve Biko, and maybe some people know of this quote. This is a quote that we're finding from Steve Biko when he was with the South African Student Organization, or SASO. So as a prelude, whites must be made to realize that they're only human, not superior. Same with blacks. They must be made to realize that they're also only human and not inferior. And I think this actually goes in well with the topics that we were able to actually have lectures on today. I'd like to thank Dr. Bianca Naude, Professor Margot Rubin, Dr. Hussein Solomon, Mighti Jamie, and Dr. Charles Small for the presentations they gave us. Now I would like Ira to help me with the questions. I was just having some problems on my side on the Zoom. It cleared everything on my side. So some of the questions are no longer with me. But we have a lot of juicy, meaty stuff that we went through today. And I'd also want to raise some questions, but I think as a moderator, on my side, having the pleasure of reading some of the stuff before, it would be unfair for me to be the first person to present a question. So if the questions can, Ira, please help me on that side with the questions.
Sure. One of our first questions came from Rabbi Bob Kaplan, who was wondering if it was indeed possible to shift from other to ally, and if the panelists had any good examples where we have seen enemies become allies.
Chair, I think I'll jump in there because I think that question was asked sort of right after my presentation or during my presentation. I've been trying to think, because I saw the question a long time ago, and so I've been trying to think of examples where enemies have become allies. I imagine that it must be possible, but I cannot think of any one example really that I could give at the moment. So I'll ask some of the other presenters or panelists to maybe jump in if they can think of an example. But you know, just from kind of my own theoretical background and you know, studies in international relations and conflict and security studies, I would say that even, you know, if it were possible, if an enemy could become an ally, and like I said, I imagine that it must be possible. And I think specifically, maybe not over shorter spans of time like a human lifetime, but, you know, the span of a time that that states exist, it must certainly be possible for states to make amends and become friends and enemies and allies. And I think that happens throughout history. But, you know, theoretically, we would think that this would take a long amount of time, and you know, the circumstances that would lead from enemies becoming allies, that would have to be quite extreme. So I see here that Professor Solomon has replied, what about the Abrahamic Accords between Israel and some of the Arab states in the region? So I don't know much about that, but maybe Professor Solomon can jump in there and help me out.
Thank you. No, I mean, I was just saying that there are these cases. It doesn't happen overnight because of these particular viewpoints, which takes long to change. And sometimes you can have an elite changing, and then the rest of the society, I mean, regards them as sellouts and so forth, you know. And perhaps if I have the floor, and there were some questions addressed to me. So Chair, is it okay with you if I just respond to some of the questions raised with me?
Certainly, yeah. I saw a few come in addressed
Okay.
to you in particular, Professor Solomon.
Sure, great, thanks. Sharon raised the issue about scapegoating of migrants, you know, is a political strategy in terms of the failure of the state to deliver basic services and to address the systemic unemployment. I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment. I won't go so far in terms of capitalism, but I would definitely agree with the scapegoating, which is what my paper was now all about. Luminiano raised the issue about social divisions and to avoid accountability and what can media houses do. Well, I mean, part of the problem is to be far more critical of sources, you know, in terms of xenophobia in particular. Civil society has been involved um, in terms of providing food, legal advice, trauma counseling in terms of migrants and refugees and so forth. But, you know, ultimately government bears responsibility. South Africa has signed and ratified various international treaties, which I had indicated, and they do need to do that. What I am concerned about is that as the economy tanks further, as we're talking about in South Africa, a third wave, you know, of COVID-19 with no possibility yet of getting our jab in terms of the vaccine, I just fear that these tensions are just going to escalate. And that's what I'm really, really concerned with. And if I may use this final, absolute final opportunity to maybe raise an issue with Dr. Small, you know, I agree wholeheartedly with many of his sentiments, but you know, it's something that I've also struggled with, to be frank. I'm a South African Muslim, and I care deeply about Palestinians and Israeli Jews, and I do not want to see the eradication of the state of Israel. But at the same time, I am critical of the policies of the Israeli government towards the Palestinians. And so, if not BDS and so on, and I do not support BDS, etc., but how then does one adopt a critical stance towards the policies of the State of Israel without being anti-Semitic? Thank you.
Thank you. Should I respond? Boyo, Ira, okay?
Means.
Okay, so Hussein, yeah, I've been speaking about respecting the other, and respecting the other is respecting the other, be it Israelis or Palestinians. And I think to be critical of Israeli policy is not necessarily anti-Semitic at all. I'm critical of Israeli policy. I think a way to, on the one hand, avoid being anti-Semitic and also concerned about Palestinians, I think the IRA definition on anti-Semitism is a helpful guideline. It defines contemporary anti-Semitism in a helpful way. And I know it's being delegitimized in a sense these days that the IRA definition is taking away academic freedom and free speech, and you can't be critical of Israel. And if you read the IRA definition, that's really not the case. So I think to be critical of Israeli policy or to support Palestinian rights is not anti-Semitic at all. And I think most reasonable people concerned about contemporary anti-Semitism would agree with me. But I think if we defined Israel as an apartheid state from a liberal or a colonial racist Nazi state, from a liberal human rights perspective, we would be obligated to dismantle the entity. And I think that's where we run into problems to delegitimize the right of the Jewish people or any people to have sovereignty over their land. So I think that's sort of the boundary. And I did a study with Ed Kaplan of Yale University where we interviewed 10,000 Europeans, and we asked them a series of questions about classical forms of anti-Semitism, and then questions which we defined as Israel bashing questions, that Israel is an apartheid state, or the Israeli army intentionally kills children or poisons the water of Palestinians, and those sort of things. And what we found was the levels of anti-Semitism and Israel bashers in Europe were relatively low. But what we found, which was amazing, is that those who we classified as Israel bashers were 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense. So the correlation is very strong. And I think people who are concerned about the rights of Palestinians should be mindful of those fellow travelers that are out to demonize the Jewish people or Israel as an entity. So that's my quick response. And then I have one question, if I may, but Hussein, if you want to rebut, I don't want to interrupt that. Okay. So there was a question in the chat, which I found interesting, from Reva Foreman. And she says that I've articulated an African notion of Ubuntu. And I don't know what that is. So can somebody please answer the question? What is Ubuntu? Ubuntu.
If I may quickly come in, but Vuyo and Mighti can also come in. I think that Ubuntu can simply be, it was articulated by Archbishop Desmond Tutu as simply as I am because you are. Okay. There have been some more recent scholarship saying that it's more communal in nature and thereby takes away, there's been a critique also about it because it is not maybe a liberal position because the emphasis is on the collective as opposed to the individual. But I will give the floor to people who are more knowledgeable on these issues.
Thanks.
Well, I'm not more knowledgeable on the issue, but just to contextualize it, it's a value system that is quite prevalent across the continent, different names for it. And actually, there's some anthropological interesting data, I think, that still needs to be collected as to why, even though it has different names and words, the collectivist or communitarian viewpoint. But essentially, it's about appreciating the value of a human being in a community, in a society, and operating in ways that do build them and give them agency, as opposed to ways that attack them and belittle them. So there is and which is why it would have been something that was referred to quite a lot in the struggle against apartheid, because it was about, there was a feeling that there was an indignity that was being perpetuated, whereas Ubuntu, even though it has this collectivist angle, also values and ascribes inherent dignity to the human. So the perspective of a person who upholds the philosophy of Ubuntu is to see the inherent worth of a person and to see that all outcomes that exclude working with and through people in ways that give them dignity are not worth pursuing. I don't know if that helps as a build-up, but there are differing interpretations and there are some critiques as have been articulated. But I think the understanding is not a removal of the individual, but a complementary perception of the individual's dignity and that of the collective, if that makes any sense.
Thank you. I have homework to do.
All right. I'll introduce. We had one more question come in earlier in the session with really the focus on internalized oppression and how societies are really able to psychologically heal and how they're able to come to make amends and move forward with other groups that might have been oppressing them in the past. And kind of leave it to the panel here to weigh in on really if there is a way to overcome these past conflicts, find workable ways forward. And the questioner particularly was focusing on psychological healing and if that was an essential element or if there could be other ideas to help bring these groups together.
I'll just say very quickly, I don't want to take too much time, but I had the honor of meeting Dr. Mohammed Alisa, who is the General Secretary of the Muslim World League. And I was one of the first Israelis and Jewish people to sit with him several years ago, about 4 years ago. And I became the first Jewish and Israeli person to speak at the Muslim World League conference. The Muslim League was controlled by Yosef Kawadawi and sort of the Muslim Brotherhood for many years, and it was the source of international anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel. It was really the foundation of international anti-Semitism for many years. And we were supposed to meet for 15 minutes, and we sat for 6 hours, and we became friends. And we've been exchanging the wisdoms of Islam and Judaism with each other. And I think at least at the top level of that very important Sunni organization, there really is a shift, and they're rewriting textbooks that have demonized not only Israel, but the Jewish people for decades. And the commonalities that we have and what we're sharing is quite profound. And I think this was sort of the beginnings of the Abraham Accords that we now know exist and have, I think, a life of its own. And then people are beginning to see each other and communicate with each other. And I'm very optimistic that this is bringing down artificial barriers of the last several decades or a couple of generations. And people are beginning to meet and speak with each other. And I think it's extraordinary. And people are being creative and doing business and exchanging ideas and thoughts and education. And I'm quite optimistic that this is the beginning of a real vibrant peace. So. Many possibilities.
If anybody has any further comments or ideas to bring forward, I think we have run through the questions that have been submitted by the participants today.
Chair, I think I might add something there. I think personally, I feel there's great scope for research on psychological healing, collective healing, some interesting research being done about collective trauma and how collectives mourn past losses and past traumas, much more psychological in orientation than much of what I think most of us normally read. But I think there's definitely scope for further research about how this has worked in practice. And I think there's a lot of theories about how collectives deal with trauma. Very interesting things that's been written about, how there's an intergenerational transfer of emotions, and how we have newer generations, younger generations mourning the losses and the tragedies that previous generations had lived through. But how that has worked, I know that Vamik Volkan has done quite a bit of work on that, and some of the other writers in psychology and psychiatry. I think also in South Africa and South African psychology, if I'm not mistaken, Goboro Madikizela, I think is her name, done quite a lot of research about psychological trauma and suffering and mourning, and then getting through this trauma in South Africa specifically after apartheid. But I think there's much more scope for research across nations about how this has happened and how it's been operationalized. And I think what I would like to see, how long lasting the healing has been. I think personally in South Africa, I feel like there was healing that happened to a certain point, and then it kind of stopped, it plateaued. And I feel like there's maybe a bit of a regression. So personally, I feel like I would like to see research about how genuine this healing has been, or how long lasting the healing has been. But at the moment, not too much about that out there.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we've received today. If anyone has any closing remarks, or can hand it to Vuyo to give kind of his final remarks today on moderating today's session. I know we've covered quite a bit in 2 hours, and I don't want to take up and everyone's Zoom attention spans can only go so far, but I'm hoping that we could have continued conversations with this group. These are unfortunately a lot of ongoing issues that are, I think, as we've kind of come to realize, have ups and downs, and these ideas will be ever evolving with them.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you for everyone who participated, everyone who came to listen, all the questions. They were quite insightful. I thought I should speak on how I see Ubuntu from what we are doing here. Ubuntu is not only about the collective. It believes that the individual is a part of the collective. You can have a seed, and that seed will create a tree for you. That tree will bring you a forest. It's all, it can start with one, it can be many, but we are all together in this thing. We came together here to discuss issues which are close to our hearts, issues that are affecting our lives, issues that a lot of people are misreading in these day and times because they're not popular enough. They are not trendy. We're coming from different backgrounds, different experiences, and we came here in the spirit of Ubuntu because we care more for ourselves. And how do we show that we care for ourselves by caring for others? It always, there was once a story of how a frog didn't want to help a turtle when the turtle was drowning. But when the frog could no longer find water, the turtle just showed its head. It reared its head and said, I want what you have and you want what I have. Only if we helped each other, we could have lived longer. And this is what we're coming here to actually deal with. I'd like to thank the University of the Free State. I'd like to thank the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy. I'd like to thank everyone here for actually coming to share their thoughts and to listen and to learn. Today's web seminar was on the topic, the politics of othering and discrimination. I'm not sure if Dr. Small has more to say. From my side, I'm quite honored to be a moderator and to come before such brilliant minds. All of you are giants in your own standing. You have brought a lot of value into my life, and I thank you all.
Thank you, Vuyo. I would just say, Vuyo, thank you very much, and Hussein Solomon, thank you for putting this together, and I hope it's the beginning of more conversations and learning and sharing, and hopefully through that we'll become a bit wiser. So it's really an honor, so thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. We'll be making today's session available online, so you can always visit our website, isgap.org, and you'll be able to find it on our Facebook page and on YouTube. Hope to see you all soon. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.